Nearly 10 months into Russia's war on Ukraine, the U.S. and its allies are still trying to find ways to weaken Russia's economy. On December 5th, a ban on all imports of Russian oil by ship went into effect. More than 36 countries are also agreed to impose a price cap on the oil Russia can sell. Ben Cahill is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ben, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
The price cap was set at $60 a barrel. Why that number?
Well, it took quite a while to arrive at this number. What U.S. Treasury officials and the rest of the G7 were trying to do is create pressure on the Russian economy and deprive the country of oil revenues while avoiding a really sharp shock to the global oil market and avoid a price that would cause shortages and a potential price spike. So when the price cap was originally proposed, I think the idea was to set it at around $40 a barrel, and eventually they decided on a much higher number. And I think the idea was basically to try to avoid that disruption to the oil market, and it probably came at the expense of cutting Russian oil revenue. A price cap at $60 a barrel probably will not do as much to deprive Russia of the revenue that it gets per barrel.
Well, but I wanted to ask you to put that number in perspective for us historically with respect to the price of oil. I mean, how high is $60 a barrel?
Yeah, what policymakers wanted to do with this price cap was to set it at a level above Russia's cost of production so that it would have incentives to keep producing oil, but it set it below market levels. And what we've seen in recent months is that Russian oil has been selling at a pretty steep discount relative to the global oil benchmarks like Brent oil. There are multiple reasons for this, but one is that, when the war broke out, a lot of companies just stopped doing business with the Russian oil industry. Big oil companies like Shell and a lot of the commodity trading houses just didn't want to take the public pressure and the heat, and they didn't want to do business with Russia. As a consequence, it had fewer buyers, and it really had to discount its oil. So in a way, what the price cap is doing is just extending and institutionalizing this discounted price for Russian oil that's been in the marketplace for some time.
So, Ben, I mean, is this expected to decrease Russia's oil profits in a way that would impact their execution of the war on Ukraine in any way?
I think ultimately the goal is to cut Russian oil revenue and deprive it of the money that it needs for its war machine. The reality is I think economic sanctions don't have that kind of immediate impact. It would probably be unrealistic to think that Russia's suddenly going to change its calculus on Ukraine as a result of these sanctions. But I would say over the medium term and beyond, the outlook for the Russian oil industry is pretty bleak. I mean, it's lost a lot of technical partners, investment partners. As I mentioned, a lot of companies don't want to do business with Russia. Oilfield services companies have pulled out. And so already Russia's really lost that ability to move to the next generation of projects, the more complicated stuff like the Arctic and deep water and shale oil, because so many people have exited. But I think it's probably not going to take much of a hit in terms of its oil revenue in the coming years. And it's still earning a lot per barrel. I mean, one of the consequences of a pretty tight global oil market is that prices have been high. So since the war was launched, oil and gas revenues in Russia have been pretty strong.
Ben, how are the importing restrictions and price caps enforced, or is it voluntary?
There is a pretty complicated enforcement scheme. The details of the price cap are quite complex. Basically, the principle is a lot of the seaborne oil trade around the world depends on services that are provided mostly by the UK and EU countries. This is stuff like maritime insurance, shipping services, brokerage. A lot of these services are really housed in Europe. And so the idea was to deprive those services for any oil trade above the price cap and force everyone in the marketplace to deal below that. The challenge there is that Russia has the option of just trying to go outside the reach of the G7 and outside the reach of the sanction system. And what we've seen in recent months is that they've done exactly that. Russia's probably bought at least 100 tankers and is trying to provide its own maritime insurance and services for that oil trade, especially to Asia. So the test for the G7 sanction system is, how much does it really squeeze Russia and prevent it from having other options? And how much can Russia and other people in the marketplace find a way around it?
So what do you recommend, Ben, as far as ways to tighten the economic pressure on Putin?
I mean, I think the oil and gas industry is really critical. If you look at government revenues in Russia, the oil and gas industry has typically provided about half of those revenues. and oil revenues far outweigh natural gas revenues. Of course, natural gas is a different story. It's essentially been almost cut off to Europe at this point. Russia doesn't really have good alternative options because it sent a lot of that gas via pipeline to Europe. So squeezing oil revenues is really the key to creating pressure on the Russian economy. I think we just have a pretty tight global market. There are obviously a lot of concerns about inflation and energy costs around the world. And by setting the price cap that high, I think policymakers were signaling that they just don't feel like there's the slack in the global system to try to squeeze Russia harder. So I think overall the economic impact is going to be pretty limited. Now, there is the possibility that global oil prices will rise. And if the Russian price cap is kept constant, it will earn less per barrel than the rest of the market, and that differential will potentially grow over time.
And briefly, what about countries like India and China, who are oil importers?
Yeah, the irony of the G7 plan is that it's really about Russian oil trade to other countries. So India, China, Turkey, and other buyers of Russian oil. And they basically said, we're not going to abide by the price cap. What U.S. Treasury officials have said is that it will give the buyers more leverage and lead to a decline in Russian revenue. And we'll have to wait and see. But we have seen in recent weeks that price cap has extended this differential between the price for Russian oil and the global price. And maybe it will extend that, and Russian will just have to accept lower prices from India and China in the future.
All right, Ben, thanks so much for being on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.